if you ask an Asian person, are they yellow or are they brown? Would the person say to you, oh, well, yes, I am yellow? Or would they say, well, what do you mean? Say, well, oh, you mean, well, yeah. The average Asian, I would venture to say, average Chinese, average Japanese or Korean would probably say, I'm Asian, or I'm from Korea, or I'm from Japan, or I'm from China, or Vietnam, or whatever. They would not use the term yellow. I'm still trying to figure out why so many of our people are so hell-bent on using the term black, given to us by Europeans, even though people will say, yeah, but it was meant to be negative. So you're going to make a negative into a positive. So by that logic, let's do that with everything. So by that logic, let's do that with everything. So let's make the word idiot mean genius. In other words, I'm trying to figure out what is the benefit of that. It is their language in that it has a lot more implicit bias, culturally imposed, a lot more mind bugs. And again, it's not what our ancestors would have called themselves in their own language. This is what especially for those who are arguing that they're being Africa-centered or Afrocentric. If we're being Africa-centered, use a term that has its roots in Africa, not the term black that was given to us by Europeans at a period in their history where they're ascending and using it to devalue us. I'm completely at a loss for that. So when I think about when Malcolm, one of our heroes, one of our saints, if you will, said, if a cat has kittens in an oven, are they biscuits? So when people will tell me, well, they're not African because they live in America or the United States, this democratic republic. And I say, well, you are still of African ancestry. And coming from a strict, if you will, Africa-centered view, especially in one of my professors and one of my mentors is Dr. Molefi Asante and the whole foundation of Afrocentricity, et cetera, right? And clearly he was trying to get us as students, he said, to recognize that we are of African ancestry, we are Africans, even if we're not on the continent. That's the attitude you have to have, that you're part of the diaspora. Now, it doesn't mean you're identical to a sister or brother who's Nigerian. It doesn't mean you're identical to a sister or brother who's from Kenya or Togo or whatever part of the African continent. Don't get me wrong. I embrace it. I used to tell my students when I first started teaching, they would make fun of some students who were darker in hue. And I used to tell my students, I wish I was that complexion. And the students look at me going, wait a minute, why would you want to look like this person who's so black, so dark? And I said, because I know who they are, because I know their value. The problem is you don't. And they're looking to me as a young teacher and going, well, wait a minute now, this young teacher, why would he want to affirm that, right? So clearly my aversion was not to saying I'm of African ancestry or that I have an aversion to being dark in complexion. My aversion is to the word black. It's not, I don't have a problem with somebody saying, well, man, you ain't nothing but you're African in America. My father, who was born in Cuba, identified himself as an Afro-Cuban. My father, who was a little slightly darker than I in hue, emphasized his pride in his African roots, his African ancestry. And my grandmother, who was darker in complexion as well, of a darker olive hue. So what I'm saying is, there's no problem with hue. It's not a problem with it's not about and it damn sure isn't about me thinking we have no history. Because needless to say, I could easily dispense with the average person talking about their knowledge of African history who makes the same argument. What I'm saying is, someone who's telling you, well, then you're negating your being, negating yourself. That's self-hatred. And then I say, well, wait a minute. I don't hate the fact that I'm descendant of the ancient Kemites. I'm not hating the fact that my ancestry is connected to the people within the Moorish Empire, or ancient Carthage, or the peoples of Mali, or the ancient Congo, or Angola. I said, where do you want to go? The Nok culture? I mean, come on. Right? I know I can tell you about Europeans worshiping Africans. Saint Moritz or Saint Maurice, who was an African saint in the early Catholic Church. Right? So, or the so-called, not so-called because they're known by this theologically, the Black Madonnas. Right? Now, that's the term that's used in say I have an aversion to using the term black for myself and for us as a collective, but in Western art history, theological art history, that's the phrase that they use. So I'm just using their term. From the African perspective, you would just say they're Madonnas, or they're images of Mariam and Isa, or Jesus. Right? That's it. But again, the pigmentocratic values that have infused so much of the European or Western world is what has us thinking in terms of black and white. And the irony is, again, the whole culture, specifically the United States, is kind of predicated on that. That's why you have a lot of Asian sisters and brothers who will say, you know, we're almost invisible because the issue in America is largely black versus white. We're just kind of in the margins. I've heard folks say that. You know, we're here too. We have a history. We have a culture. But the irony is that relative invisibility, historically speaking, right? That's changing now with the rise of China, but was largely allowing folks in, say, the Chinese American community to continue to build, to network, and to strengthen their communities, and to do well under some very oppressive conditions at times, right? Because the Chinese also at one time were prevented from immigrating. Immigrating to the United States. The Chinese Exclusion Act, until it was repealed, I think after about 3 decades. But there was a long period of time when they couldn't become citizens because of a fear of China's presence. In fact, part of what people talk about, the yellow peril, that was a term from those days. The yellow peril was what they said. They were afraid the Chinese were too foreign to be absorbed into U.S. culture, Americana. But what it was straight up racism against this Asian community, the Chinese. But here's the key. Even though the mainstream media was often calling them the yellow peril, they didn't continue to call themselves yellows. So I'm trying to figure out why folks are still, trying to hold on to black. Here's my guess. The people very often who will tell you you're the one, because I've heard the same thing, and they come after me too at times saying based on my complexion too, because make an assumption. And I say, look, I just told you I've dedicated my entire professional life to uncovering and to teaching the legacy of African people, our contributions to the world, right? I was disciplined and dedicated enough to make that my mission. As the French might say, my raison d'être, my reason for being, or d'être, reason for being. But this idea of saying, you're doing that because you're self-hating, I turn it around and say, I think you don't want to call yourself African because you're not comfortable with being of African ancestry. You somehow think black gives you an out. Why? Because your image of Africa is still pejorative and you won't admit it because you still have contempt for many sisters and brothers who are from Africa. That's what I think. And when I've said that at times, I've heard people say, well, actually, well, yeah, I can't stand. And I'm like, I see it came out. And then I say, look, you can meet people from African countries who you don't like. You can meet people from European or Asian countries you don't like. You don't then deny your connection to your own roots by recognizing you're of African descent. You just say, I was talking to this Nigerian guy, a man, if you want to say brother, and the man, he tried to rip me off in the store or whatever, right? But that doesn't mean every Nigerian now that doesn't make any sense. Or people will sometimes say, well, but look at Africa today. Africa's in such turmoil, right? Well, yeah, Africa is in a lot of turmoil, there's no doubt. But the turmoil is the result largely of first the enslavement system, the asiento, followed by colonization or colonialism, followed by imperialism, which did everything it could coming out of the West primarily to prevent Africa from being able to ascend. That is not to excuse the fact that there are bad African leaders and have been. But what we need to understand is many of those bad African leaders were sought out by outside powers that wanted to put them in power so they could continue to rape the resources of Africa. Africa's resource rich, but the people on the continent as a whole are resource poor, right? Something else that refers to what I said before, it's kind of like the Jedi mind trick, and that is one of my mentors, the late, great C. Tessalone Keto, who was born in South Africa, trained as a historian, wrote a book called Vision, Identity, and Time. He basically was the first person to bring to my attention the history of South Africa and the process of telling the indigenous Africans they were not indigenous as part of the educational system. So they simply said, you all weren't here when we arrived. This is the formal education these people were getting. Also called them Cathars, which is a derogatory term, as well as blacks. And what did the people who settled there, who were from the Netherlands and from the UK and other parts of Europe, but mostly from the Netherlands, meaning the Boers, and then like I said, many Brits. What did they call themselves? In particular, the Boers? Afrikaners. What do they call the language? Afrikaans. Think about what I'm saying. Psychologically, they got themselves and many of the Africans, thank goodness not all, but many of the Africans, to identify with being black more than they identify with being African. And then they formally, meaning the Boers, they formally called themselves Afrikaners, meaning Africans. So think about that. So now you're the newcomer. You arrived in the Cape area a few hundred years ago. Yes, your ancestors have been here for a long time, if long means a few hundred years. But you have now mentally, and you might even say psychically, conveyed to yourselves, you are more indigenous and have greater rights to the land than the people who you found when you got here. And you've convinced many of the people you found when you got here that they don't deserve to call themselves Africans, that they see themselves first as blacks. Because the only thing that can really make a difference that is lasting is then when you see all the components of it, right? Because you're trying to construct a whole new worldview, a whole new reality, but I dare say one that's drawing from your own traditions. And I'll say it more clearly, the best of your traditions. Because you could say there are certain traditions that we did or of it that we need to leave alone. That's true of any culture or any nation or people. But what's the best, and even the great, and I do say great because I have great respect for him as well, Dr. Milena Karenga, who says, you know, you're supposed to draw from the best of Africa, the best of African traditions, put forward the best of what that means. So if certain things that need to be doing, whether it's people bringing up issues of excision or female circumcision and things like that, that they'll say is practiced in some African societies, I would agree that that may be going on for hundreds of years or thousands of years, but it's not something necessarily needs to be continued, right? But, and that's just my personal opinion. Other people may have a different opinion. I don't agree with that practice of excision or so-called circumcision for women. But I do think that when you're talking about the best of African cultures, respect for the elders, recognizing the interdependence and interconnection of all things, which means you have a greater respect for nature, or nature. It means that you clearly know that I'm important because we are important. The communalistic view versus the individualistic view. The desire to remain in harmony with nature, right? Those are just a few examples of what we would say were part of a traditional African worldview. The extended family versus the nuclear family construct. That's why customarily, I mean, how long we've been calling each other brothers and sisters, right? This idea of recognizing, even when I went to visit family back home in Bermuda for the first time when I was a child, everybody calls everybody cousin. So they were like, what's up, cousin? And I was like, cousin, right? Some people joke and say, well, it's because the country is so small, everybody is a cousin, because everybody's so related. But the other piece is, it has to do with our particular value system, our axiology, that you are an extension of me. So I'm trying to do what I can to make it in the world, but without causing you much or any harm if possible. And I certainly see your value. I'm not going to devalue you because you look like me. What am I saying about myself, right? If I do that. So the term Black is no different than the term Negro. And so if somebody is using the term Black, say, well, if you spoke Spanish, you'd be calling yourself a Negro. Do you accept Negro? And 99% of them obviously would say no, right? So like I say again, just say if you don't want to get with the Moor thing, as some people say, at least get with reason and say you're an African. I mentioned when we spoke a little earlier about there was something known as the All African People's Party that I was introduced to when I was in graduate school. And there was a sister and brother in Philadelphia who were members, and they were basically saying the same thing. And they weren't Moors. They were trying to tell people, look, you're African. Yeah, you're born in North Philly. You're an African living in North Philly, right? You're African living in Newark, right? And at the time, they had some success, but very little, because people wanted to be black. Why? Because black in their minds was better than being an African. I go back to what I said before. The self-hatred, I would argue, is coming more from the person, this is my argument, who says that they don't understand why you don't use the word black. And them not having people say, flipping the script and saying, well, but for you, why don't you just call yourself an African? Well, because I don't want to affirm the fact that this is, being of a darker hue is good. I know that being of a darker hue is good because the people of Africa basically represent the same thing. Do you have to push that? Does a Chinese person have to affirm yellow when they're arguing their value, or the yellow complexion of their skin, or what have you, if that's going to continue to use these color names, right? To me, it's not a very consistent argument. Just call yourself African. And certainly, do you need to be calling somebody white if you really believe that they're not superior to you? I think about, and I've shared this once before, a situation with my uncle. My uncle worked for the Transit Authority in New York, and he talked about a conversation he had with a Japanese coworker. And this is probably late 50s, maybe early 60s. Because I asked him when, he said sometime around the late 50s, early 60s. He said this Japanese man came in, he worked with him in the for Metropolitan Transit Authority. He used to do carpentry, repairing the trains, the subways. And this man would basically keep to himself. He would just come in and bring his lunch, and he would sit down and eat. And, he might nod or something to people, but he kept to himself. And this continued for some time. And then one day, my uncle, who was a member of the Moorish Science temple, had understanding about the Moorish legacy, was talking to some brothers who worked with him, and laid it out. Sounded, I imagine, probably a lot like I sound in terms of sharing historical information and talking about context and everything else. And when he finished, he said that he sat down to eat, and this Japanese man got up from his table, which was a little further down, came over, bowed. He said, "Now we can talk." Amnesiatic, right? Subjugated or oppressed. This idea of people not knowing, which results in many people who do know, not wanting to associate with us. Because as they say, we don't know how to act. And it's like, look, I don't know what I can trust you with in terms of talking with you. Or I don't know what you're going to do, because you may have no honor, because you don't know who you are. If you know who you are, you clearly have honor. If you know who you are, that's why, just as a sidebar for a minute, a sister or brother who really does their best to live according to the principles of the Christ, I ain't got nothing but love for them, right? I'm saying those who live the principles, because that's someone who essentially, has some honor and is trying to do the best they can to make a better world. That's not to be confused with folks who go to church, but ain't nothing seeping in with regard to that. In fact, a lot of times people's focus now is on, what do they call it? Prosperity gospel. That's good, that's well, but you also have to teach something about the ethical foundations of what the Christ was conveying. Because prosperity without ethics is an accident happening, not even waiting to happen. So that experience with my uncle, I think, is just a good example of what I'm saying in terms of a more contemporary, as in 20th century manifestation. And I myself have had experiences where people from other countries, when they heard me talking about Moorish history and identifying myself as Moorish, even as I also emphasized that my father's from Cuba, say, why is your name? Look, I'm not denying the nationality of my father. What I'm simply saying, you can be Cuban and Moorish too. I'm pointing out that Moorish, in terms of, this is a reference to what was once the old imperial boundaries of the Moorish Empire. Even the name Cuba is a Maghreb Arabic term for place of sanctuary. So, you know, and is that by accident? Right, and that's why it's not Cuba, it's Cuba. Koubba would be the proper spelling. So they're even telling you, when Columbus went to Cuba, he's on the Oriente, he's on the eastern coast. Clyde Ahmad Winters, who's a historian, talks about looking through the Spanish sources and seeing in Columbus's journey account that he claimed to see minarets on the eastern coast of Cuba. That's Columbus when he's coming into the area on board the ship. So, is that a shock? So the minarets are like a steeple on a church. Mosques have minarets. So to see this, if anybody would know what a minaret looked like, it would be some Spaniards on a ship in 1492, right? So based upon, like I said, Clyde Ahmad Winters' work that was in, and he quotes people like P.V. Ramos, and I think that was in African Presence in Early America, I think is where he had written that article, because it's in concert with, and that's an edited work by Dr. Ivan van Sertima. So it's actually Dr. Ivan van Sertima's book. So this is telling us even about those connections, right? Brazilian Muslims that people often don't make reference to, which were part of these religious groups that brought different people of African ancestry together. So people practicing traditional, if you will, African spiritual systems. And then you had people who were practicing an African interpretation of Islam that goes back to the marabouts. And in fact, there are names, Maravitinas, Marabillos, which are Native American surnames. How do you get a Native American surname, Marabillos and Maravitinas? These are all derivations of Marabout. Even Moabite, which was a term used also for the people in the 11th and 12th century who were in, where? Al-Andalus. So you have the Spanish Catholics referring to these people as Moabita, who are also known as the Almoravids. So someone's going to tell me that, you see what I mean? Where the emphasis on trying to be quote unquote Orthodox or Sunni will often shut down people's willingness to say, well, wait a minute, let me look at these other expressions of Islam. Now, like I said, I have nothing against someone who chooses to practice the orthodoxy, whether it's Sunni or whatever. But the point is, don't negate the value of what is contained in looking at the history of the Murids or the Marabouts and its connection to Moorish science teachings and its connections to Sufi tradition, because what you do is you should know better, right? The pen of the scholar is mightier than the sword. So the idea of saying, look, I'm about truth. Allah's not going to be angry with me for seeking truth. That's what I'm supposed to do. Right? So when people get all bent out of shape because they're questioning things, if questioning it is for the purpose of producing something that is destructive, there's a problem. But there's nothing destructive in Moorish science based upon what Drew Ali is talking about. How can you be upset with principles of love, truth, peace, freedom, and justice? I'm trying to figure out what people are talking about, right? And if you're saying that you see the importance of recognizing your connection to your creator, what is wrong with that? This discussion of Francis Cress Welsing, the late great psychiatrist, our elder and now ancestor, who talked about global white supremacy. And of course, he was building on the work of Neely Fuller, who had suggested this idea to her, and she, as a psychiatrist, then developed it. And basically, as you may know, it goes like this, that the European or the so-called white community largely has an inherent fear of black people, quote unquote, because of a fear of genetic annihilation. Now, that makes some sense, certainly when you look at what has happened in terms of the genocidal engagement by the European world. The problem with it, and I just say problem, meaning you can always find those aspects of what might be called an exception or outliers. You can look at periods in European history when Europeans wanted to intermarry with Africans. What period was it? The period of the Moorish Empire. Why? Because the Moors were the ones in positions of power. Because the Moors, who had introduced so much in the way of culture and advances in science, all of a sudden became very attractive. So there's less concern for issues of genetic annihilation because you're looking at these people as really having value. The idea of fear of intermarriage would certainly make much more sense if one is afraid that they're marrying into a family that will reduce their intellect, their ethical, if you will, core, or something that's, it's affiliated with what we would say now, genetics, right? But clearly, when Moors are in positions of power, the attitude of resentment towards us, just for being of African ancestry, Moorish, was not cut and dry. It's more complicated because it involves issues of power. So that if one is in a position of power and someone is in a position of knowledge, imagine, medieval historians have sometimes referred to the Dark Ages as cold, hard, and brutish. And that's referring to when Europe fell into a period of kind of cultural and social decay following the collapse of the Roman Empire, which was a great empire. The Moors, starting in the late 7th, early 8th century of the Common Era, have brought in the best knowledge from the ancient world, things that had existed in ancient Kemet or Egypt. In fact, George James talks about the Moors as the custodians of Egyptian culture and history. And George G.M. James doesn't get enough, I think, credit for his contribution in Stolen Legacy. Got his doctorate, as I understand, from Columbia University. So this was no slouch. But James said the Moors were the custodians of ancient Egyptian culture. The Moors, the Muslim world interacting, now has connections to China, to India, Nile Valley. Western Sudanic empires of Mali, Ghana, and Songhai, as well as Persia and throughout. And I would even venture to say connections and trade with the Americas. But all that ancient knowledge that Africans and Asians, and even the knowledge that the Greeks had possessed, was something that the Moors, meaning the African or African and Asian Muslim population, had brought together and are spreading throughout Europe, pulling Europe out of its dark ages, setting up institutions of higher learning. Clearly, such folk are going to look very attractive, certainly to the rank and file. The only people who would see those individuals as not being attractive would be those in positions of power. Now you're talking about the conflict with the church, right? The Roman Catholic Church, who would see that, wait a minute, we have to do all we can to try to demonize or negate these people because we're losing our parishioners. So the history of Al-Andalus, or Moorish-controlled or Muslim Spain, is one of kind of these communities trying to negotiate this relationship, right? Where you have people of Christian descent living next to people of Jewish ancestry and Judaism and Muslims, and that would include Africans, Asiatics or Asians. And when I say Asiatic in this context, it's because the mainstream tends to use Asiatic specifically just to use in reference to areas of Near Asia or Western Asia or the so-called Near East. Whereas I tend to use Asiatics, again, coming out of the Moorish perspective, as representative of Africans and Asians collectively, if you will, the more melanated peoples, right? But this idea of the church then needing to, at that time, do all it can to devalue people of African ancestry, which also will then serve their interests with the rise of the asiento, the so-called enslavement trade, controlled by the Spanish, but ultimately contracted out to other European Christian countries. You can see how the devaluation of African people begins in the cultures of those places, right? And needless to say then, the pigmentocracy will start to rise with it, so that as the African world is eclipsing, with the fall of the Moorish Empire being a major contributor to that, the rise of the pigmentocracy, where people are now, just like the power structure, like I said before, was different, people are trying to look more like those in power, and increasingly those in power will first be the Spanish and the Portuguese and eventually the British. The term Negro was used by Spanish and Portuguese speakers against the various African peoples they engaged, whether they were in the Senegal, Gambia region or elsewhere. They even used the term for Native Americans as well, people who were dark in complexion, who they encountered in the Americas. The reason is because they didn't recognize, who was it? Oviedo and Sepulveda, who were two Spanish conquistadors who were theoreticians of issues of how to engage nations or races. How are we supposed to engage in the world? And in fact, one of my mentors, Dr. Asante, who actually brought this out, I think in his book, Kemet, Afrocentricity and Knowledge. But he's the one that said that the conquistadors argued that it was okay to enslave the Indians because they didn't have nationality. It's okay to enslave them because they didn't have nationality. In their minds, they had so objectified these indigenous peoples. They had reclassified them as, like I said, negros, or even if they use the term indios or Indians. Some of them, if they made treaties with different groups, then again, a treaty implies I recognize that you have nationhood. But if someone is adhering to the term that I'm using to deny your existence as a person, then you are telling me you're not a person under the law, right? You just told me you're a Negro, you're black. Terms that existed in US law and in much of European law, and specifically the term black for those of British law, for someone who didn't have personhood, right? Or you'd have to qualify it, black person. But if you said blacks, it was understood that a person who you defined as black, or Negroes can't be citizens because Negroes under the law were never meant to be citizens. Negroes are property. And when people tried to make blacks or Negroes into citizens, it caused a constitutional rift, right? That's the conflict. And I tell you, when you look at the foundations of the conflict between North and South, starting in the 1820s, also in my book, I talk about the colored mariner laws and the colored mariner laws of 1822, which South Carolina passed because they said they needed to control people of color or people of African ancestry who were coming into South Carolina's ports, the Charleston port in particular. And they said, if anybody who was colored came into that port, they were subject to being seized and put in jail and possibly sold. But guess what? That law didn't apply to Moors, and it didn't apply to Indians, East Indians, a group known as the Lascars. Now, this in part relates to the fact that there was a treaty that existed between the U.S. and the Moorish Empire, but it also relates to those who were simply following the law and saying, if you're calling yourself colored, Negro, black, this country requires that for you to be a citizen, you have to be free and a national. So even though this group is now called white, I can ask you, what's your name? O'Reilly. Oh, you're an Irish national. What's your name? Heimbach. Oh, you're a German, and so forth. If you couldn't affirm your nationhood, you were not a protected national. Democratic republics, which is what the country was and presumably still is, during the days of slavery, you would have had citizens, aliens, and slaves. Aliens can become citizens if they're naturalized. Slaves were legally defined as property. So if you're legally defined as a Negro can't have the rights of a citizen. At best, they can be given a granted privilege. So when also the late, great John Hope Franklin talked about quasi-free Negroes, quasi-free meant, yeah, you weren't enslaved, you weren't on a plantation, but your rights were essentially non-existent. You were given privileges by certain southern states in certain counties or what have you, because you were not seen as a threat and you were just kind of functioning there, but nobody recognized you as a full citizen. Now, in contrast, if you were known to be a recognized national, even if you were dark in complexion, there were court cases, and I reference some of those also in my book, and I mentioned earlier the case of William Dungy and Abraham Lincoln, where people were told, I'm not going to let you vote because you look like you're a Negro. And so the person had to go to court and prove to them that they weren't Negroes. So how did they do it? By proving that they were either Native American or in some cases saying they were Moors, right? The petition of 1790, the Sundry Free Moors, right? And then the Sumter Moors, sometimes called Sumter Turks, another example, right? So if you were recognized as a national, even the Southerners in slave states who were upholding the law were saying, technically, under the law, these people can be citizens. That's why, and again, the legal cases that I quote in my book, where they say clearly, looking like a Negro or having an admixture of Negro blood doesn't necessarily make you a Negro. Now, that may sound confusing to people, but it's because you have to understand how the law operated. If you're descendant of Negroes, but something happened where you've now reacquired or recaptured your nationality, you're no longer a Negro, right? That's what happened in the case of Abdul al-Rahman, who was taken and sold into slavery. He looked like any other so-called Negro. He's held until someone discovers he's not a Negro. And he was telling people all the time, I'm not a Negro. Why is he telling people in the course of them trying to figure out who he is? He said, so even he knew that much. He kept, I'm not a Negro. And they said, well, I'm confused. You look like a Negro. It's because Negro in the popular mind, the perception one had meant that you were of predominant African ancestry. But that's not what it was. It's like people go to visit European countries, and if an African-American brother or sister went, as I've heard this, to different countries, and if they're over 6'4", the first thing they say is, you must be a ball player. You got to be a basketball player. And they're like, well, no. Well, because every African-American I've seen your height always plays ball. Well, in the context of what's going on in the 18th and 19th centuries, every Negro I've ever seen looks like this. But then that person, that's the difference between de facto and de jure, that average person living in the South, average European American, man or woman, they didn't know the law. They just doing their best to make a living, as they say. And all of a sudden they're told that that person who was enslaved next door for 27 years was not a Negro and should not have been enslaved. They're all kinds of confused. But who knew? The judges would have known. The lawyers would have known. The Supreme Court officials or justices would have known. That's why even in Moorish teachings, the prophet said, go to City Hall, those who know the law, and you will get a favorable reply, right? Understanding that that's the purpose of knowing something about the law. The sad part is some people have gone off in all kinds of other directions with that and misinterpreted what Prophet Noble really actually taught with regard to that. We're a part and parcel of this said government, with all the problems that the government has, all the foibles and problems that it's had historically. But if you recognize you're a full citizen, you know your full rights and powers to engage and change it. That's what citizens do.
In this documentary, we took a deep dive to uncover the hidden negative effects of Black identity. We also demonstrated how you can begin your journey towards real freedom in America by embracing your Moorish descent. But this is just scratching the surface. Expanding on this topic are hours of more documentaries that completely disrupt the historical lies, societal norms, and narratives that have shaped the quote-unquote Black identity. Now you can continue embarking on this groundbreaking journey of self-discovery that challenges conventional notions of identity and empowers the quote-unquote Black people to redefine who they truly are.
The 14th and 15th Amendment does not address citizens of the United States of America. It addresses U.S. citizens. The Prophet Noble is specifically referring to us as citizens of the United States of America, and that, of course, is on our nationality identification card.
She took a sampling of different mummies to find that these mummies had ingested coca, the coca leaf. They also found high rates of tobacco, not African tobacco, American tobacco. Nile Valley civilization was in trade with different indigenous peoples in the Americas.
The Moorish Science Temple of America in 1913 created the corporation, the corporation Moorish Science of America of 1928, and it created it for a purpose. The United States of America created the United States for a purpose, and the purpose was that now we're going to create a federal government out of this here.
These and other series are all a part of our ongoing expansion of Amexem All Access, where we completely unpack a large range of pivotal topics. All Access members can access other deep dives into quote-unquote Black identity, the Moorish Science Temple of America, Prophet Noble Drew Ali, and Moorish Science, as well as high-quality interviews, educational courses, and a wealth of other resources. All this content is available on All Access, ad-free platform. By subscribing to the All Access annual plan, currently available for less than $3.66 per month, you gain full access to our ever-expanding library of content. Your subscription not only unlocks a treasure trove of knowledge, but also supports our team in creating more ambitious, evidence-based content. So don't wait to start your personal transformation journey. Watch these documentaries right now by clicking the button on your screen or following the link in the description. Your support enables us to continue shedding light on these crucial topics. Thank you for your support. Peace and love.